ready for liftoff. So, on the count of 3, you're all going to say, John Muir is ready for liftoff. So, John Muir, are you ready for liftoff? 1, 2, 3. Let's try one more time. 1, 2, 3.
Oh, you're back. So you ready for me? Okay, I wanted to print off the first sheet of the implementation plan. Okay, so first of all, let me introduce myself, everybody. So I know that there are 750 middle schoolers that are participating in Student Spaceflight Experiments Program Mission 13 to the International Space Station. And I'm assuming that's all of you right now, is that right? Okay, so I'm kind of the guy that's responsible for all of this in the sense that my name is Jeff Goldstein. I'm the Center Director for the National Center for Earth and Space Science Education, and I created and oversee the Student Spaceflight Experiments Program. And I wanted to give you a little bit of background on research and how the Student Spaceflight Experiments Program works. And I think that some of you already know a bit about this, but let me just say that I'm an astrophysicist, and I get to study what's up in the sky. I get to study the universe. And in fact, my friends and I have a specialization. We study the weather on other planets. We look at the temperature and composition of the atmosphere of other planets beyond the Earth. And we also measure winds on those planets, how the winds are blowing on those other planets. So we're kind of interplanetary weather guys, which is kind of cool. But I wanted to tell you that what it's like to do astrophysics, what it's like to do real research on the frontiers of human exploration. And in the case of myself, just as a personal example, my friends and I had to build a very special machine called an infrared heterodyne spectrometer. And we did that at a NASA center called Goddard Space Flight Center, which is not too far from where I am here, close to Washington, D.C. And every year, for a few times a year, we take the spectrometer to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and we take it to the top of a dormant volcano called Mauna Kea. And the summit of Mauna Kea is at 14,000 feet, so it's almost 3 miles into the sky. And we hook the spectrometer, we hook this machine up to one of the most powerful telescopes on Earth. And we can point that telescope to a planet maybe 100 million miles away. It could be Venus, it could be Mars, it could even be a very large moon like Titan, which is the largest moon of Saturn. And we're able to measure the composition of the atmosphere, the temperature all the way down to the surface of the planet, and we can measure the global winds, the global circulation on those planets. So it's really cool to be an astrophysicist. But I should also tell you a little bit about what it feels like to do research on the frontier. And I can tell you that when you are at on the summit of Mauna Kea, there is a marker that locates the highest point on that summit. It was put there by the U.S. Geological Survey, and it locates the highest point on Earth in the Pacific. So when I'm going to the top of Mauna Kea on the Big Island of Hawaii, it's the highest point on Earth in the Pacific. It's like you're on top of the world. And when the puffy white clouds roll in, the cumulus clouds roll in, they roll in a mile beneath you, so you feel like you're on a rock floating in the middle of the sky. And when the sun sets, 10,000 stars fill the sky, and you're overcome with this sense of majesty because you're looking out into this thing we call the universe, and recognizing that because of everything that you've done, you may be able to see how nature works, how she works in a way that no human being has ever seen before. So when we see something new because of our research, we take the entire human race with us. And that's a remarkable thing, because when you look in your science books, if you read about what we know about the world around us, the greater universe, at some point everything you read was determined, was figured out by scientists on the frontier trying to pull back the veil of nature and seeing how she operates. At some point, everything that you are learning now was absolutely new to the human race. And all of that wisdom over past generations is given to you, the next generation, so you can take the human race where we've never gone before. And so let me say that, and what I wanted to do, these first few minutes was to give you a sense of what it's like to be a scientist. And I should also, by the way, point out that science is fun and it's emotional, and it builds upon a natural curiosity that we're born with to explore our world. But let me also tell you a little bit about how I got interested in science, because I think that that's a really important story for you all to hear. And I think the way to say this is that every once in a while, something happens in our lives, something happens in your life, where it is such an important moment in time that you stop in your tracks, you stop and you think about what you just experienced, and you're never the same again. And if you've never experienced those moments, talk to your parents, talk to other adults, because they certainly have. There are these moments in our lives that are so powerful, that impact us so powerfully, that as we think about what we just experienced, we are never the same again. And it could be something that is very personal. It might be something in our families. It could be something that the entire world experiences. It could be something tragic. It could be something glorious. But there are these moments in time. And I remember when I was in 6th grade, so same age as many of you, it was the first time I experienced this when I was watching a black and white television set. I was 11 years old. And I saw a human being put a footprint on another world. I saw Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walk on the surface of the moon on television. Nobody had ever done that before. And I remember walking out at 9 p.m. Eastern Time in Uniondale, Long Island in New York. And I looked up at the moon 240,000 miles away. And I realized that there were 3 people up there. And then I could walk right inside and watch Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking around or hopping around on the surface of the moon. And I and hundreds of millions of human beings all over the planet experienced that. And I bet there are some teachers in that audience that remember that moment in time, because it changed the entire human race. In that moment, we became what's called spacefaring. We were able to break free of our own gravity and go to another world and put a human footprint on another surface for the first time in history. And in that moment, it changed me so dramatically that I knew I wanted to be a space explorer. And I knew that I had gifts for math and science. And I asked scientists and engineers that were professionals, what is it like to be a scientist? What is it like to be an engineer? What are the choices that you made to go from where I was in middle school to the frontiers of human exploration? And I'm telling you this because you're the same age as I was when I made the choice to be a space explorer. Now, many of you might not like space. You might not, science may not float your boat. That's okay. Every one of us have different gifts and talents and loves. And so you should be exposed to lots of different career choices, lots of different pathways, so you can hopefully marry what you love and those gifts and talents that you have with a job, so that when you do your job, when you get into a job, when the paycheck comes, you can say, oh, I even get paid to do this. It really should be about joyful education leading to joyful employment. We ought to be heading towards jobs that are things that we love to do. And I can tell you that every one of the teachers in that room right now went into teaching because they felt that it was a calling. They felt that they needed to help the next generation go places they've never been. That's why your teachers teach. And so that's a job that is so important and meaningful to them that they feel education, body and soul. So I wanted to give you a sense that there are these moments in time that change who we are, that allow us to take what's called stock of ourselves and try to figure out pathways moving forward in terms of a career. Now, I can tell you that every generation has to inspire the next. That's the game that we're all playing. And I can give you an example. It's like many years after I was inspired as an 11-year-old with the Apollo missions to the moon, I was invited by the principal of Buzz Aldrin Elementary School to visit the school a week before the students arrived and get the teachers really fired up about exploration and learning and science. And I told Gina Ross, the principal, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And so I went over to Buzz Aldrin Elementary School in Reston, Virginia, and I talked to the entire teaching staff, which was, I would say, about 70, 80 teachers. And I was talking about how I got inspired when I was 11 years old when I saw Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walk in. And there was this picture that I put up on the screen of the lunar module, the lunar lander, coming back to the command module. So the way that it worked is that as they got to the moon, there was a capsule called the command module that circled the moon. And in it was Michael Collins, and he stayed in that command module. And Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong went into the lunar lander called Eagle and went down to the surface of the moon. And they were on the surface for in this historic journey. And as they were coming back to the command module, Michael Collins took a photograph outside, right through the window, showing the upper portion of the lunar module, the lunar lander, coming back. And as I was showing that photograph, the door in the back of the room opened up, and it was very squeaky, I remember it. All the teachers stopped to understand who was walking into the room. And Buzz Aldrin walked in. My hero walked in, and I was just talking about him. And he walks in and he looks at the photograph on the screen, and he says, "Oh, that's me and Neil coming back to Mike." It's like historic photograph. It was one of the most historic photographs the human race has ever, I mean, it is the most historic photograph of the human race in terms of journeys somewhere else. And he's talking about it like it's a family photo album. That's me and Neil coming back to Mike. And afterwards, after I was done, I tried to get through that talking to my hero. It was really hard. I remember I had a lump in my throat. And then I finished my presentation, and all the teachers and Buzz Aldrin ran out into the hallway. And I was packing up all of my equipment, trying to figure out what just had happened. And I went out into the hallway, and I saw all the teachers around Buzz Aldrin. And he saw me, and he kind of made his way through the teachers, and he came over to me, and he gave me a double-handed handshake. He never met me before, but he gave me one of those really friendly handshakes where you grab a person's hand, and then you hold it with the other hand, too. It's a double-handed handshake. And he said, "That was really inspiring, Jeff." I mean, he knew my name. He must have asked who I was. And he said, "That was really inspiring, Jeff. Where did that come from?" And all I can remember is not thinking, but looking him right in the eye. And I remember again swallowing really hard. And I looked at him and I said, "It came from you. It came from you." His generation inspired mine. And it allowed my generation to go places the human race had never been before. And you are now the next generation. And this program, the Student Spaceflight Experiments program, was created to pass all of this forward to the next generation, to inspire you so that you can go where nobody's ever gone before. That's why this program is so important, because what it does is it captures what real research is all about. You are part of America's space program. This is not a simulation. We are counting down now to the launch of an experiment that one of your student teams is going to be selected for flight out of Kennedy Space Center in Florida and be transported to the International Space Station, a vehicle as big as a football field moving in the sky at 4.5 miles a second, 250 miles above the surface of the Earth. And your district, in fact, has its own space program because this is the second year you're doing this. One of your experiments came back in August for Mission 12 to the International Space Station. So the idea behind this program is to recognize that formal education, your school, its responsibility is to prepare you for the future. Its responsibility, formal education's responsibility, and everything your teachers and your principal and your superintendent and the Board of Education, everything that they're all doing is allowing you to get ready for the real world. When you leave education, you're moving into the real world and you need to be ready for it. And if some of you want to go into careers in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, it is important for you to understand what the real world expects of scientists and engineers. It's important for you to understand what scientists and engineers actually do. And so this program is about taking a real research experience and embedding it, in this particular case, at the middle school level, so that you can all be scientists and engineers. The way I should really say this is that you are part of America's space program. This is not a simulation. And all of you are truly microgravity researchers. You are microgravity researchers. And I can tell you that I get lots of calls from newspapers and television and radio from lots of communities across the country when we're about to launch the experiments for the next mission. And they call me as the program director and they ask me about what the kids in, Kalamazoo, Michigan are doing. And I stop them right away. And I say, wait a second, these are not kids. These students are being asked to design real microgravity experiments against real engineering constraints imposed by the mini laboratory they must use. And these students are designing real experiments against the real technology constraints imposed by flight operations to and from low Earth orbit. And these students are writing real proposals against a real proposal guide, just like professional researchers. And all of those student proposals go through a review process, just like professional researchers. And the student team that is selected as the student team that has the selected flight experiment has to go through formal flight safety review at the NASA Johnson Space Center Office of Toxicology, just like professional researchers. So everything that you're doing as part of this program is real. And you are indeed all microgravity researchers. So does everybody understand where I'm coming from with this? Yeah. So what I wanted to do is give you a sense of what life is like as a scientist, and I can speak, personally as an astrophysicist. I wanted to give you a sense of how scientists get excited and what kind of sparks scientists and engineers when they're young to pursue these careers. And I gave you my personal example with regard to Apollo 11 when I was 11 years old. And I wanted to tell you the Neil Armstrong story, rather the Buzz Aldrin story, because it really illustrates how every generation has to inspire the next and pass forward the ability to do things we've never done before. And the Student Spaceflight Experiments program is a really good example of how my organization created something to allow you to see what it really is like to be a scientist and an engineer. So, Dave, is there anything else that you would like me to specifically talk about today?
Can you do a little demonstration of microgravity?
A demonstration?
No, the best you can.
I think the best way to say it is that microgravity, when we talk about designing microgravity experiments, it sounds very technical. But in reality, microgravity is simply the technical word for weightlessness. That's what microgravity is, it's weightlessness. And you have all seen videos, maybe on YouTube, of what it's like in a weightless environment, because you've seen astronauts in space floating around as if gravity doesn't exist where they are. But we know that gravity exists in space because the Earth goes around the sun because of gravity, and the moon goes around the Earth because of gravity, and the International Space Station goes around the Earth because of gravity. So gravity is alive and well and very strong in space. The reason that the astronauts appear weightless, it appears as if gravity is turned completely off, is because the astronauts are falling. They're in what's called free fall. And if you're in an elevator in a very tall building, and if I cut the cable holding the elevator so the elevator starts to fall, well, the force of gravity exerted by planet Earth will cause the elevator and you to accelerate. But you're accelerating together, which means that let me kind of put it this way. If I'm standing on a little chair, if I'm standing on a chair inside my elevator, and my elevator is at the top floor of a very tall building, and at the moment I am walking off the chair, somebody cuts the cable, well, me and the chair and the elevator start to accelerate down towards the surface of the Earth together. And what's kind of interesting inside the elevator is if I move down a certain distance, the floor of the elevator will move down the same distance. So if I'm stepping off the chair a foot above the floor when the elevator cable is cut, then I cannot get to the floor. Because as I'm moving down a certain distance, the floor underneath me is moving down the same distance. I can't get to the floor. And what I see in my elevator is I'm floating a foot above the floor, just stepping off the chair. I'm floating in that elevator as if gravity's turned completely off. Now, the reality of the situation is the force of gravity exerted by is causing elevator and me in the chair to accelerate down. But inside my elevator, there are no windows. I can't see the world rushing by me. Inside the elevator, I see an elevator. And in that elevator, I'm floating. So the irony is that in a laboratory that is freely falling under the action of gravity, everything inside that freely falling laboratory will behave as if gravity is turned completely off. The astronauts are weightless because just like the elevator, the International Space Station is falling under the action of gravity. It's just that it's falling around the Earth. And so the whole idea behind microgravity experiment design is to understand the role of gravity in something you want to study, whether it's a biological system or a chemical system like oxidation or some physical system. And we know, for instance, in the case of, biology, that gravity plays a role. So if you look at a germinating seed, if you want to study seed germination and microgravity, well, we recognize that a germinating seed knows about gravity because when it germinates, the roots go down and the shoots go up. That's called geotropism. So if you want to understand the role of gravity in something you want to study, you have to change the gravity variable. That's how we do science. If we want to study something, we keep the variables constant and change one of interest, and we see how that system responds. We see how what we are studying responds. That variable that you're changing is called the independent variable. So if you're studying seed germination, you might be interested in how much water you give the seed. You might be interested in how much light. You might be interested in the temperature, the composition of the soil. And you can change all of those things to see, for instance, how much, what the germination, once the seed germinates, what light plays, how light plays a role in how that plant grows. If that's the case, you change the amount of light that you give it. If you want to understand if a particular species of wheat grows in a very dry climate, the independent variable might be the amount of water you give it. If you want to understand what the role of gravity is in something under study, that's got to be the independent variable. You need to change it. But we can't change the force of gravity exerted by planet Earth on anything. We can't change that. It is what it is. So you trick the system. You trick what you want to experiment on by bringing it to a freely falling laboratory like the International Space Station, where it will behave as if gravity is turned completely off. And if you run the same experiment on the ground, in gravity, that's your control experiment, and you bring your flight experiment down, well, your flight experiment operated in the seeming absence of gravity because it was in a freely falling laboratory, and your ground control experiment operated in gravity. So by comparing the two, what you've changed is the gravity variable. And you want to see if the system behaved differently in gravity versus in a weightless environment. Because if it behaved differently, that might provide some evidence for the role of gravity in how that system works. So it's classic science. The independent variable is the gravity variable, and the only reason it's a little bit strange is that since we can't change the force of gravity exerted by Earth, we have to trick the system into thinking there's no gravity by bringing your experiment to a freely falling laboratory called the International Space Station. So Dave, does that help?
That's excellent. We are out of time, so we want to give you a big
You're welcome, and everybody have fun in America's space program.